Welcome back. We are pleased to continue in Perek Yud, the 10th chapter of Shar Yichud B'Emunah. We're holding on page 174 in the original text. The line begins V'nikrois, pretty much in the center of the page of 174, and we're holding El Lagabe Hanivraim, vis-a-vis the creations, El Yenim, the Tachtenim, superior, inferior creations. But what's Alter Rebbe talking about? It's difficult to begin a class of Ella. So the solution is just to click to find the previous class, and so those of you who follow the previous class could appreciate that we can the Ella immediately, even though it's good to recap a bit, at least something to appreciate where the Alter Rebbe is coming from, that he concludes Ella L'gabei Hanivroim Eleinim V'Tachtenim. So we do mention this time and again, namely for the newcomers, that to find this previous class in this Shar Yichud B'Emunah, or all the previous classes for that matter, in this segment, and we mentioned that we merited to conclude the entire Likutei Amorim. They're all in the same website, which is tanyaonline.com. Now wherever you're watching it, it's always good to tap into the original as well. Even though wherever you're watching it probably has a text, but it has a text of the present class. The advantage, I would just say, also you could follow the class as you continue with the text. In other words, the text is set up, the site is set up, the text is on a separate scroll bar, as such, easy to follow. We mentioned this again quite a few times, but namely for the newcomers. So the previous class is an example to know where the Alter Rebbe is coming from, that he starts the Ella today, and today again in today's class. And then we start with the Ella. The Alter Rebbe has a whole message in Perek Yud, that is, and again it's a click away. So we really need not to take much time to invest to spend in today's class, other than presenting today's information. So again, that's tanyaonline.com. Just to get into it though, to recap very briefly, and to get into it, to understand what the Alter Rebbe is saying, Ella. So in the overall, the Alter Rebbe will bring out one point of the Alter Rebbe's message in last week's class, that the Alter Rebbe says that this is the reason why the Chachmei HaEmes, the wise of truth, which means they were well anchored into the truth of Elokus, of godliness, the truth of Torah, the Emes Hashem, and the Emes of Torah, and that's where they were called the Chachmei HaEmes, and they use the terminology associated with Hashem's midas, and for that matter, the Alter Rebbe says includes the Chachma Min Hadas, and the Ratzon of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they call them Eires, light. Why so? So generally, the whole Shar Yichud B'Emunah is about the gateway into oneness and faith. Again, we mentioned this many times. This, just 12 chapter, the segment, all of 12 chapters, Alter Rebbe opens up a new window, a new understanding, a new appreciation, like totally different than anyone ever appreciated the Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, that proclamation which we proclaim and protest every single day, a few times a day for that matter. And as much as we can appreciate the message of Hashem Echad, Alter Rebbe presents over here with this information in Shar Yichud B'Emunah some information that is truly transformative. Metamorphoses the whole approach on Hashem Echad. And again, you don't have to take my word. One learns Shar Yichud B'Emunah every chapter, not necessarily going into the depth, the depth and the commentaries on the chapter on the Shar Yichud B'Emunah, which there is quite some bit written on the Shar Yichud B'Emunah, but just to understand it chapter after chapter after chapter, to understand and appreciate the Alter Rebbe's message. Like we mentioned the other day, Shar Yichud, you come into this gate of oneness, the way it's presented by the Alter Rebbe, you're not going to come out the same way. Inevitable. It's granted, guaranteed. So in this, the message generally is, again, Alter Rebbe is pointing out the Yichud, the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In every chapter, in every segment, every part of this segment of Shar Yichud B'Emunah in a different way, even though, again, we mentioned a few times, there's the sequence, the first, second, and third, and then the fourth, Alter Rebbe opens up this, he introduces this new idea of a Kela Gadol, in other words, explains what this rather the Gadol and Giber, the two midas of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In the end of the day, it's two expressions of the same HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He takes it further in Hey in its very unique way. Vav pretty much brings it home, and Zayin elaborates on this very idea in much detail and articulation, and with this he clarifies a few other matters known among Yidden, even certain ideas in association with Achdus Hashem among Ge'eni Yisrael in the past. You know, if Tzimtzum is Kipshutei or Tzimtzum not Kipshutei, again, we're not going to go into it now. You could see it's a click away. In chapter 7, yes, it's quite a few classes. Chapter 7, that is, quite a few classes given. The Alter Rebbe dissects many of important matters associated with the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which there was even arguments, again, even this idea Tzimtzum Kipshutei, Tzimtzum is not Kipshutei, which was a famous argument among even Ge'eni Yisrael. The Alter Rebbe clarifies, once he brings that message home from Vav into Zayin, there is no question. Mikan yesh lahavin, right away says shigigas miktas chachamim beineim. In other words, they didn't appreciate this. They didn't want to present this idea of tzimtzum kipshutei advertently. It's shigigas miktas chacham beineim. In other words, it was something that the Rebbe points out in the onset. It's an error. And in the end of the day, Tzimtzum is not Kipshutei. And when we say Tzimtzum is not Kipshutei, that's kind of an explosion of the message of oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, just by saying those words. Tzimtzum not Kipshutei. Again, we explained it in detail then. And then the Alter Rebbe continues with this message of oneness in Ches and Tes. And you can couple Ches and Tes together. Brings the famous Rambam again. It's not fair that we take this time. Again, you can see it yourself. It's a click in Ches and Tes, and you can find it corresponding to the text. The message which you're looking for, again, with scrolling the scroll bar of the text to see pretty much where the information you want to glean and gain. And Yud, he says, with the Alter Rebbe says, also coming from Tes, that the midas are called Rosa de Himeim Nusa, the secret of Emunah. But Alter Rebbe says now we could pretty much understand why the Chachmei Am is called the midas of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which, as we mentioned, includes the Chachma Bina Das and Ratzon of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as Oires, as light. And again, Alter Rebbe kind of is even contrasting to Tes, Raza the Memnusa. But let's try to understand what, with this message of the Chachamim calling it Oires, that we can appreciate with our own mind the oneness, the absolute oneness of the midas with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Again, we spoke about it then in the beginning of the chapter Yud. Relating to the end of the chapter Tes. So basically, one point before we go on to Elo, the Alter Rebbe speaks about the idea that any extension of illuminator doesn't begin, it doesn't commence, it doesn't initiate where you can identify it. Alter Rebbe goes on mathematically, even if you will. If it's able to extend itself out of the illuminator, for sure, how much more so it shines in its original place where it has the kayach to come into expression, which is within the illuminator itself. And he gives the example, and again, this works with any type of illuminator and light. If it's a candle, it's a flame and the light of the flame. The ray, the actual light, which comes from the flame. But Alter Rebbe gives again the example of the sun, which would be a classic example. There's the ball of the sun, and then there's the ray, which comes from the sun. So there's the idea of that oneness which comes as a result, or that you can see the oneness of the ray with the sun. The ray just expresses the character of the sun. The sun is warm, the ray extends warmth. The sun is bright, the ray extends brightness, understandably so. The ray is totally dependable on the sun goes away, there's no ray. Granted. So there is this phenomenon of oneness between the sun and the ray, understandably so, yet you can't say it's an absolute oneness because it's two ideas. This is the ball of the sun, this is the illuminator, and this is the ray. This is the extension. And therefore, as much as they're one and the total constant dependability of the ray to the sun, nonetheless, it's two entities. So the Alter Rebbe says, when the Chachamim called the Midas of HaKadosh Baruch Hu Eidos, they wanted to demonstrate another layer, which is a layer of absolute a layer of a demonstration and a message of absolute oneness. And this is again the Alter Rebbe says that if the ray is able to extend itself out of the ball of the sun, how much more so It's within the ball of the sun, within the luminator. And again, this is something which you can calculate. If it has the ability to extend itself from here and onwards, and where is it getting its light and its energy? Where is it gaining its energy, getting its energy from? From the illuminator itself, from the ball of the sun. So how much more so within the ball of the sun, it begins to shine. It's there, and it has the ability. In other words, it exists. And it shines one way or another, virtually, theoretically, because again, if it extends itself out of the sun, how much more is within the sun? Yet, when you look in the sun itself, you will not find the ray, at all for that matter. It stands with a complete bittul, a complete self-nullification, in a way that it's not even identifiable. Because within the ball of the sun, what only exists is the illuminator. You try wherever, any way you're going to try to find the light, knowing that it ought to be there. Again, mathematically it ought to be there, and somewhat it is there, but you cannot identify it at all, because there it's only the illuminator. And again, simple. Within the ball of the sun is only the sun itself. The light, the ray begins out of the sun. So it doesn't actually begin out of the sun. Certainly it's there within the sun, but nonetheless there it's not identified. You can't identify it. It's not identifiable. This is basically the synopsis, was the Alter Rebbe saying. So, and what the Alter Rebbe is basically getting at, the same thing, lahabla, when it comes to Kodesh Baruch Hu, that the eidos, these midas, are just out of, so to say, and out of, this is what we're going to learn, legabei hanivroim. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in essence, they're truly one with Mahusei Vatzmusei, with the core essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is the Moyer. We did mention again famous Fabrengen of the Rebbe, which he so eloquently presented this idea that Chas v'Shalom, to call HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moyer, illuminator. In the end of the day, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is beyond any term, any definition. But not to go into it now. In this context, he speaks about the Moyer and the Eir. He speaks about the Midas of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Mahusei Vatzmusei, the expression Mahusei Vatzmusei, the core essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So these Eidos are in essence truly one, not only dependent on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they're truly one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because they're always within HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we say with always within HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is a very important point. The sun, as grand as the sun is, the Rambam writes 167 times the size of the planet. Yeah, very big. But nonetheless, very large, but nonetheless, there's an end. It comes to an end. It stops. The illuminator has an ending, and then begins the ray, the shine. When it comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then you say, yeah, here you're an entity on your own. Here, theoretically, you also exist, but there you're not. You're not identifiable at that point within the Maya, within the illuminator. When it comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we say less asar panim minei. There's no place which is devoid of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Maya is everywhere. The Maya, which is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's no place you can say, oh, this stops and therefore something becomes identified or even identifiable, because the Maya is everywhere. And in essence, the Eid is truly one with the Maya all the time. These midas, and again, this is the reason why they call them Eidos, they call them midas, to say they're always one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. To the extent, as Lashon Alter Rebbe, they're not to be identified on their own at all. No midas, because they're always within the Maya. In other words, a total absolute oneness with Mahusei Vatzmusei, with the core essence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Here the Alter Rebbe comes in again, we pick up today, no midas, what? The whole idea of Ratzein, Chachma, Bina, Das, which is, and the midas of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is presented in Kabbalah and Chassidus, and we find it in Medrash, in Nigla the Torah. He brings over here a Medrash, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Basar Dvarim Yibra Olam, the world was created with Chachma, Bina, Das. And the idea of Sfiris certainly exists, starting from famously starting from the Sfiris Datzilus. Chochma Datzilus, Bina Datzilus, and then Das, and then the Midas, starting from Chesed and ending in Malchus, which these are the 10 Sfiris. So certainly they exist, we know they exist. So what does it mean? How does it go together? Eina El is B'Shem Klal, that they're not identifiable, but yet we know they exist. That's extremely oxymoron. Oxymoronic, because how could you say that they don't exist, and yet we do have the spheres and we know they exist, and they truly exist. So, but what's that supposed to mean? If less asar panim minei, the moir, which is the illuminator of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's no end, it's always within HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the as such, the midas, again, that's the reason the Alter Rebbe says they're called Eidos, because they wanted to demonstrate the true oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the absolute oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So what does it mean that there's Spheres? So the Alter Rebbe says, yeah, there is no Spheres, it's only Legabei Anivroim. In the face of the Nivroim, Elyenim v'Tachteinim, the superior and inferior creations of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shaviyosam v'chayusam v'hanagosam shakadosh Baruch Hu mahava mechayayisam v'manhigam hu birtzeini v'chochmosu v'inose v'daitem slash v'midei sabakdeshis. And to translate, it's in the face of the, again, Nivroim, the creations, superior and inferior, which they're coming to existence, and they're being vitalized, vivified, and their conduct, means Hashem's conducting them with His providence, that Hashem brings them into existence and it brings them into existence and gives them life and guides them and leads them with His desire, His wisdom, understanding, His knowledge, which are invested in Hashem's characters and Hashem's attributes. And He brings Kiddush Medrash, like it says in Medrash, Basar Dvarim, the world was created with the 10 Dvarim. It's not Asar Mamoris, not to get confused with Asar Mamoris. This is the 10 Dvarim. And what is the 10 Dvarim? Again, as we're going to learn about the Sarah Mamoris and Perek, how do they fall into the picture? Where do they come into the picture in Perek Yud Aleph? Mamoris is associated with the last sphere of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Malchus Peh, which is, again, we will explain this there, but it's not the 10 spheres, it's all these Mamoris, are the 10 sayings associated with the final attribute of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But here he says that the HaKadosh Baruch Hu Dvarim, not Maimoris, which is the 10 Dvarim HaKadosh Baruch Hu, things which HaKadosh Baruch Hu used to create the world. Literally translated Dvarim and B'chochma B'tun V'das. So we do find these 10 spheres and how they come into play. So the Alter Rebbe says that's only the Gabei Nivraim Elyeinu V'Tachteinim. It's not for real, meaning to say it's not HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Chas V'Chalila defined with these definitions. It's in the face of this which Hashem's creation. And we do understand, before we go on to try to a bit more reconcile or explain this reconciliation, that we do understand that, yeah, you needed Chacham Bin Adas. There is Chacham Bin Adas. This world is created by design. Just take even the division of these, the 4 elements, the inanimate, the world of vegetation, the multiplicity, and we don't even know everything which Hashem created even in our own world, how many species there are, and within every level and within every one of these elements, how many, again, as much as we know that there's so much we don't know. So we see there's design, the inanimate, the world of vegetation, the botanical world, and then you have the animal world, which is the chai, and there again the mammals, the creatures, and also this is just, there's certainly a design over here. And then on top of that you have the medaber, the sophisticated human being, and then the yid, which you see that there's chacham bin adas. You see there's design, there's wisdom over here. And then you see there's certainly, like Alter Rebbe says this twice over here in these 2 few lines, v'hanogosam, there Hashem has a system. There's chesed, there's gvura, which is kindness, discipline, mercy, and then the other midas, netzach, yisei malchus, to which HaKadosh Baruch Hu leads this world. And the overall, Pasuk says, you go in my statutes. It's mitzvah, which is again learning Torah, toiling in Torah, do my mitzvahs, do them scrupulously. I'm going to give you rain. Also, Gishmechem has the connotation of the physical blessings. And then there's spiritual blessings, meaning to say a yid is able to establish the sensational relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which also comes as a gift with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm ready to relate to you. I mean, this is a system which Hashem has. You're in with me, I will extend kindness. And Rachmana litzlan the other way. Then there's Gvura, Rachmana litzlan, severity. And then there's compassion, and even room for severity. Nonetheless, I had Rachmanas. I had pity on you. I mean, this is a whole system that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created, which is the phenomenon of Schar and Einish, where the Rambam calls it Amud, Godil, a great foundation, literally translated a beam. But it's a great beam, meaning to say this holds up the whole a world, which means in its relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's a great foundation. Yisod Godel, the whole idea of punishment and reward and so on. This is a system. So we see HaKadosh Baruch Hu's midas coming into play over here in Hashem's Hanhaga. So there's design and there's a system. So we can appreciate that, but nonetheless, the Alter Rebbe says that's only in the face of the Nivroim. It's not Chas v'Shalom, the Eibishter himself has these midas. Hashem himself is Chochmah Bina Das, Chas v'Shalom to say so. To the contrary, from the perspective of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's the Eir which is completely one with the Ma'ir, to the extent that it can't even be identified at all in the Lashon Alter Rebbe. This which we learned last week, Einei Eila B'Shem Klal, it doesn't even have it's not even identifiable. And just to understand this, again, a little example. We gave this example, you can't say in a total different context, because this example itself was mentioned. The Chassidus mentions it, even interesting, Alter Rebbe doesn't mention over here, but other places it is mentioned. The Chassidus, in the Alter Rebbe's Chassidus, which but again, so by extension, it's in the end of the day the same message of oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but in this very context, it is a similar example, even though it's not exactly the same idea we tried to convey with this example in the previous chapters. When we speak about, for example, in the end of Perek Vav, or even back to Likutei Amarim, famous chapters Chav 20 and 21. All this is a click away, by the way. And again, just to mention it again, we have as well, we merited to conclude Likutei Amarim. So you can find all these classes of Likutei Amarim, the famous two chapters, 20 and 21, speaks about the same message, very similar to the Shaykh of Emunah, Hashem Hu Elikim. So we brought this following example, but again, this example applies over here as well in this context, and try to say this in brief, as the master, which decides to accept upon himself this mandate to be a teacher. And let's use the example, we did this as well in the past, let's say the knowledge, the scholarship of Torah. Very well, in Yiddish would be behavent, which means very well acquainted with all Kol HaTorah, Kol, the entire Torah, all its details and its Rishonim and Achreinim. A Yid was a Yid which there are great Talmid Chachamim even today, people who know Kol HaTorah Kula. So he's a prodigy, he's a goyin, he's an Ilui. And what does he utilize his time to learn Torah and to get deeper into this which he studies in the breadth of Torah. And again, the investing in his nature, his default nature, is to invest in the depth and the breadth of Torah. A Talmid Chacham, a Yid must learn in Torah, and he has knowledge, and he has profound knowledge in the entire Torah. And then he accepts upon himself this mandate to be a teacher to a pupil. And again, not necessarily someone who's shvach, who's weak, a healthy, good, solid student, which is again just new at it, by age, by stage, and he has to start. He accepted upon himself this mandate to teach this child, this pupil. Understandably, even though his objective and goal is that this child should also one day become a Talmid Chacham, and at the end of the day have the same knowledge, information, and depth that he gained, starting from his own teacher, for that matter, and he gained over the years in his involvement in Torah, and that's his objective, and that's his goal, and possible and probable that the child will reach this stage of learning Torah one day. But doesn't mean because this is his objective and goal, he's just going to open the Gemara and open any study Sefer and start learning and teaching the information the way he understands it, with his own depth and breadth of information that he's so familiar with. The pupil won't have anything to hold on to. It's a waste of time. The pupil won't have any. It's not like the student would have some information, certain levels it won't be clear in certain ideas, but with certain ideas would chap, because in the end of the day he's conveying all the depth of the Torah that he knows. No, the student won't have any knowledge at all. He would come into the class, leave the class the same way he came into the class. So what does the master do? A healthy, structured, responsible master, he contracts and he condenses all the study, and he starts kind of a new way of conveying, meaning to say that he contracts all his knowledge, yet understandably he wants the child this pupil to start understanding slowly but surely, and eventually, yes, his goal is that the child should learn and know and grow in his Torah study, but nonetheless, in the beginning, he has to really contract everything. And sometimes he has to start with stories and parables and metaphors. And what is and understandably placing the message of this metaphor within the metaphor itself, which is the nimshal and the mushal, and slowly but surely the child starts understanding that in the beginning he realizes the story, then he realizes the message, and then as he grows with this studying, with this this master, this teacher, he starts understanding that these stories are just a conduit through which he will get to an important message, and he starts appreciating the message, and slowly but surely he starts growing in Torah. It says sometimes it takes 40 years. But in the very beginning, when the master sits down with a child, how does the child perceive this master? A storyteller. Someone walks into the room, wow, this is a talented story, and he doesn't know the caliber of this Talmid Chacham. Yeah, talented storyteller. And then he starts with mishalim, parables, and metaphors, and euphemisms, and so on, and yeah, that's really cool, very interesting the way he puts this. And then even when he starts investing the message, the nimshal within the mashal, that's also a talent, and for that matter, it is a talent. It says in Chassidus, the one who knows how to put something into a mashal, into a parable, it comes from a greater depth and a greater perception, a deeper perception on a matter, and greater hands-on, the chachma, the fact that he could put it into a mashal, and there's a lot of talent there also, not to get into it, but someone who just hears this on the onset, yeah, he realizes, or he's a storyteller, or he knows how to say beautiful parables, and then there's the message which ultimately would come out through this parable. But at the onset, it's not, you don't see this Talmid Chacham for what he truly is. And then back to the Talmid Chacham himself, when he says the story, is he just a storyteller? Not at all, for that matter. We spoke about this then also. For example, the Medrash speaks about the relationship of Moshe Rabbeinu and HaKadosh Baruch Hu with Am Yisrael, Moshe with Hashem, and Hashem with Moshe, and Hashem with Am Yisrael, and Moshe being the interface between Hashem and Am Yisrael, and Eichem et Beinechem and Elokeichem, like it says, the pasuk says, someone who connects Am Yisrael to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Medrash says multiple stories, and also different times, different periods, if it's by the Chet HaEgel, or by the Menaglim Mekeirach, Mashal HaMelech, famous Medrash, Mashal HaMelech. And let's say this is the time when the master explains this to the child, to this pupil, and he says an example of a king. By the Talmid Chacham, when he says Mashal HaMelech, it's not like 30 seconds later he's going to put it together, yeah, that king is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The child, maybe it would take him 30 minutes, or 3 full minutes, in order to understand that this Melech is referring to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. By the master, it's not 3 minutes, not 30 seconds, it's not 3 milliseconds as well. Right away, when the master says Mashal HaMelech, he's referring to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's no contraction, there's nothing of all this transpiring in the master at all. It's just in the face of the student, or anybody not knowing the level of this Talmid Chacham, listens to this demonstration, or listens to this class given over by the Talmid Chacham, perceives him in a certain way, a storyteller or a good parable giver, if you will. But it doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist at all. When he says Mashal HaMelech, referring to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he had a good friend, he's referring on the onset to Moshe Rabbeinu. By the pupil, yeah, it'll take him some time to realize it's just a parable for something deeper. And what is this saying over here? Why are we using this mashal? We're just using this mashal that you see that something could virtually be and not exist at all. It's not an existent factor, but yet to the other side of the coin, it does exist. And in the one who's talking is the same Rav, the same master. And in this case, it's the same HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is expressing himself through Chochmah, through Bina, through Das, which is invested in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Midas. But this is all Gabe Nivroim Elyonim, Chas v'Shalom, to define HaKadosh Baruch Hu with Chochmah, Bina, Das, and Ratzon and Midas. It's like saying this master is a great storyteller. He's not a storyteller. He's an Amkan Gadol, somebody who has captured and has hands on the entire Torah with the greatest depth. He's not a parable giver, and he's not a storyteller. And in this case, HaKadosh Baruch Hu chas v'shalom to say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has the rotzen and chochma bina das. Not at all. Eine eilis b'shem klal, because the moed lesasar poni minei. The moed is always there. The luminaire is always there, and as such, the eiris, which are the midas, are always within the moed. It's just like Gabi Hanivroim. You see, there's creation, and creation elyenim mitachtenim, all levels of creation, and you see there's design, and you see there's chacham in the bina das. You must say that there's chacham bina das, which is associated with this creation. Basara dvarim nivra ha'olam. And Dr. Rebbe is going to bring a few proofs with the chachma and the bina and the das. But the message is, it's only l'gabi nivroim elyenim mitachtenim. But l'gabi HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as we said, Eine Eilis B'Shem Klal. We look forward to continuing. Have a good night.